All right, take it away, Katie.
All right, let me get my screen set up here.
In the meantime, if you're local, we have another in-person class. We had one in Elkins on Saturday with Katie's husband, Mike, and we will have another one in Morgantown on April 27th, and that will be at 11 a.m. And it will be at 201 Scott Avenue at the Monongalia County Conservation District office. Pretty easy to get to. That address will take you right there. And if you go to the registration form, you can find those addresses, but we'll go ahead and email those out with our next meeting invitation. That way everyone can have that and attend that if they so wish. The one in Morgantown, there's also going to be one June 1st, planning way ahead there. But it'll be here before we know it, June 1st in Shepherdstown at Shepherd University. So that'll be another great class. It will be the same class as Morgantown. So if you're planning on attending both, you will be getting a repeat. But it will be at Shepherd University at 1 in the afternoon, and you can keep an eye out for our ads for more information and a room number on that. And you can always go on our website, www.wvfarmers.org, to sign up for any of the classes or to make sure you're on the email list so that you get all the information that we're sharing out about this program and the other programs that our organization offers. This program is through the USDA, the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. So that is who's funding this, and I will now let Katie go because she's ready.
The one thing is that the screen sharing I think is not working again. It says screen sharing is paused.
Okay, let me fix that real quick. Do I want to continue? Yes. It was wanting me to share my own. I don't want to do that. Let me make you a co-host, Katie. Maybe that will work. And then unshare and try again.
All right. There we go. All right.
Maybe. We see a white screen right now. There we go. Perfect.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, great. All right. So welcome to, I believe this is session 3. And today we're going to be talking about organic field production. I am Katie Brownell, and I run Red Hawk Rise Organics, organic vegetable and fruit farm in Jefferson County, West Virginia. So today, what we're mainly going to concentrate on is probably what most people think of when they think about the differences between conventional and organic production systems, which is how do you manage pests, diseases, and weeds when you're in a organic system and don't have access to some of the same things that you have access to in a conventional system. So we'll both talk about the general concept, and I will also include some information about specific things we do on our farm. I did include a lot of information in this slideshow because this is a big, a pretty major component of organic farming. So some of the stuff I will go over kind of the bullet points of, but the recorded slideshow will be available if there's stuff that you want to go back and get more of the detailed information. So one of kind of the key thing to start with is what is foundational management techniques versus remedial management techniques. So foundational management techniques many people probably also refer to those as preventative. So that's when you're taking measures before you have a big issue with weeds, pests, diseases. You're doing things in advance to try to prevent there from being a problem, whereas a remedial would be something that's reactive, where you're responding to something that's when you already have had a problem arisen. So we're going to discuss both of those and how they're used and what the regulations are in the National Organic Program. So just really briefly, I have included throughout the actual rules in the National Organic Program. You are required, it's really important to know that you are required to use the preventative or foundational techniques before you can move on to remedial ones. That is an actual requirement of being organic. A lot of stuff, I think that people think it's, something that organic farmers choose to do, but this is, written into the rule that you have to prove in your yearly systems plan that you have implemented these preventative techniques before you've moved on to remedial. And so this is the language that then talks about if the preventative techniques are insufficient, that's when you are allowed to move on to more remedial ones. So what are examples of foundational versus remedial practices? And then we'll dive more into this deeper. It can be something like excluding the pests by things like row cover, drip irrigation, crop rotation, using disease-resistant varieties, and generally building healthy soil. So those would all be practices that you could be implementing on a daily basis on your farm to prevent big problems from arising, as opposed to remedial practices, which are ones that you're going to take when you already have an issue. So that would include hoeing or cultivating weeds, physically removing pests from plants or removing diseased plant material or weeds from the farm, releasing natural enemies. And then, of course, there are the organically allowed fungicides or pesticides, which we talked a bit about that in the first webinar about what is allowed in terms of that, is that they cannot be synthetically produced. And I'll talk a little bit about which ones we use on our farm. So we're gonna spend a lot of today talking about the foundational practices, because that really is the core of organic farming, is building a farm system that's relying on techniques that are going to help prevent you from having, massive problems from the get-go, and having to rely at as little as possible on the remedial techniques. So this sounds pretty basic to say, how do plants grow? But that really is the essence of organic farming. The most important thing you can do to prevent pest and disease issues and weed issues before they happen is to grow healthy plants, because healthy plants, just like healthy people, are going to be less likely to succumb to pressure from pests or to diseases. So you really need to know what each individual crop, type that you're growing needs in terms of sun, temperature, water. And then your job as the farmer is to help them get what they need in order to be as healthy as possible. And that includes, providing healthy soil so that they're getting the nutrients they need. And that's something that we discussed in the last webinar, if you want to find out more about building soil health. So one of the first foundational practices I wanted to talk about is selecting the correct variety of crops for your farm. This was something that I kind of came to slowly, because I started out working on a farm that only grew heirloom varieties. And so I was, heirlooms versus hybrid varieties. Heirlooms are going to be open pollinated. They're going to be much older, whereas hybrids are going to have, parents that are two different types of plants that are going to then produce another plant, but you can't produce that plant again from its own seed. So it's a little more complicated and energy intensive to produce them. But in organic agriculture, I've really discovered which heirloom varieties work really well and can stand up against pests and diseases. And I've learned to turn to some of the hybrid varieties that have disease resistance. Some of my favorites that I grow every single year are 5-star grape tomatoes, Carmen peppers, which I would highly recommend. Downy, DMR stands for downy mildew resistant 401 cucumber, and downy mildew resistant basil varieties. And growing those just is a huge headache off of you, because the variety is going to be able to do some of the work for you. Another really important tool is plant spacing. So obviously, depending on the type of plant you're growing, you're going to have proper spacing in the row between each plant you're planting, and then between the rows. And it's really important because you need to be allowing enough space for the plants to be getting the amount of nutrients they need from the soil and not be crowding each other. They need to be getting enough sunlight so that they can photosynthesize and, live their plant life the way that they're supposed to. And they need to have enough space that they're able to get airflow, because otherwise that's just gonna, spell disease issues if you have tight plants that aren't getting enough sunlight. So this is one that I'm just gonna allow to be a reference point, where I have listed the crop spacing that we use. We are operating on a 2.5 foot wide by 50 foot long bed system. It's because we use a BCS walk behind tractor, so we only have 18-inch paths. If you're using a standard tractor, you're going to have different widths of paths and beds, so you may end up being able to plant more rows per bed or something like that. But this is what we use with a BCS on our farm. Another foundational practice that's really important is knowing which plants you're going to transplant versus which ones you're going to direct seed. So transplanting would be if you're, either purchasing a plant that's already partially grown, or what we grow our own under lights in our basement. Other farmers may grow them in high tunnels or greenhouses. But the benefits of transplanting can really set you, sorry guys, can really set you ahead in terms of outcompeting pests, diseases, and weeds, because you're putting in plants when they're already bigger. So they're going to be able to get a jump start on the weeds. They're going to be able to get a jump start on the pests, because it's just going to be harder for a pest to completely take out a plant that's already, a significant size, as opposed to a plant that's just emerging as a seedling. So crops that we transplant and crops that we direct seed are listed here for your reference. And feel free to, look back at this later to kind of see what we do on our farm. And these are also tools that you will need or may need for transplanting versus direct seeding. For transplanting, I think it's a little more standard, but for direct seeding, I would highly recommend, if you're going to be growing, especially if you're going to be growing, you can see in the very light picture that's behind the slide, you can see that there's salad mix planted in very, very close rows. The way that I'm able to do that is by using a pinpoint seeder. The one that I purchased is from Johnny's Seeds. And I would highly recommend, if you're going to be doing a lot of a lot of direct seeding, that you look into these seeders. They're going to be massively more efficient and massively more accurate, so that you won't be wasting seed and having to spend time thinning out crops. I would definitely recommend looking into seeders such as the Earthway seeder and the pinpoint seeder. Another very important foundational practice that I think often kind of gets overlooked is how you irrigate your crops. And, of course, we all hope that we get enough rain that does the job for us. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes we get too much. Last year, we barely got any. And so we do on our farm definitely rely on irrigation. And probably the type of irrigation we use the most of is drip irrigation. If you're not familiar with this, I would recommend Google searching it. It's basically very thin plastic piping that emits the water at a slow and consistent rate. And the big benefit of this for disease control and weed control is, well, for disease control is that it keeps the water off of the crop's foliage and the leaves. That's usually the biggest place that you're going to experience disease issues. So by decreasing the wet areas for diseases to form, that's going to massively help you in disease control. Also for weeds, it's going to help because you're not getting the entire bed wet. You're getting the bed wet in very specific areas. And so that's going to limit the amount of weed germination that happens. The drawbacks of drip irrigation, all these things are going to have benefits and, cons to them as well. So it does only irrigate the small section of the soil, which is going to limit microbial activity in the entire bed. And it also may limit plant root growth. I've never really experienced that. I've never experienced the plants not growing roots that are providing them with enough nutrients. Another obvious downside, it's made of plastic, and that's not great for the environment. Overhead watering, that's the other type of watering we use. We're, a small scale operation. So you'll see big overhead watering equipment on bigger farms. We are using either sprinklers or hand watering. This originally, if I just think about this, it sounds like a bad idea to overhead water because you're going to get the foliage wet, which can increase pathogens. It also wastes water because about half of the water that you put down in overhead watering evaporates. But there actually are some good benefits to it, it will get the whole bed wet, which will increase microbial health in the soil and therefore nutrients for your plants. It will increase more robust root growth. But one of the biggest reasons we use it is it provides a cooling effect for plants that are more susceptible to heat in the summer, because that can keep their leaves wet and help set them back from getting overheated and bolting. So I do actually utilize overhead watering as a preventative technique for preventing stuff from going to seed when the weather is hot. So we put any crop that's super susceptible to foliar diseases, we always have on drip. And then most crops that are either spaced out more widely or transplanted are also on drip. On our farm, this is how we run our drip irrigation. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, those all get more drip. They're a little more water intensive because we're producing them for the fruit. Everything else gets a little bit less. When it rains, you do have to factor that in. So I do have a rain gauge outside. I keep track of the amount of rain, and you're going to need to decrease the amount that you're watering based on the amount of rain you received, with the exception of any beds that have something like a plastic mulch on them, in which case the water is not going to get through from rain. So those are being watered regardless. Overhead watering, on our farm, we water beds like baby greens, where it's just planted too tightly the way that we plant to lay drip. And as I mentioned, we also overhead water to regulate temperature of cool weather crops on hot days. We use both a hose and hand water. That's how I would say 90% of the overhead watering is done. And also, if we have very dry or very hot years, we will sometimes use sprinklers throughout the farm as well. We talked some about crop rotation in the last webinar, and crop rotation is definitely a very important, crucial foundational practice, and is also required within the National Organic Program, that you have a crop rotation that you're doing yearly. It's going to help with pest and disease control because you're moving the crops away from where they were the last year, which is going to change availability for the pests and diseases that want them. Suddenly, the Colorado potato beetle, that doesn't fly. So suddenly it overwinters in the soil where the potatoes or eggplant were the last year, and there's nothing there that it eats. And so that's going to slow down how long it takes them to get to the potatoes, which means the potatoes are going to get a jump start on the bugs. They're going to be bigger and better able to handle pests by the time they get there. Diseases are the same way, where not all of them overwinter, but some of them do overwinter in the soil and or on crop residue, weed residue, and by rotating what's in an area, you're going to, just delay or decrease the pressure from those pests and diseases. You do have to look into what things share diseases, though, because something's not in the same crop family, it could share diseases. So you kind of need to take that into account when planning a crop rotation. So benefits of crop rotation to plant health: it's going to help with nutrient cycling, which we talked about in the last webinar, because different crops are going to have different demands on the nutrients and are also going to create different amounts of residue, so that you're not always drawing the exact same amount of nutrients out of the soil. That's going to help the soil health remain strong for years and years instead of just that 1 year. It's also by rotating your crops around, you're going to increase the biological diversity both above and below the ground. Specifically, you're going to be feeding a more diverse diet to the soil organic matter, which in turn is going to allow the soil organic matter to feed, the crops in a much better and more consistent way. Benefits for weed control. This is where I really see crop rotation very obviously how this plays out, whereas pests and diseases, that's a little more subtle. And over the long term, weed control with crop rotation, I can see almost immediately as the year starts. Different crops are going to outcompete different weeds better or worse than other ones. So a fast growing crop is going to outcompete certain weeds. Bigger crops with bigger leaves are going to outcompete other ones. And so by rotating crops around in a thoughtful way, that's going to really help to decrease weed pressure. Of course, there's always going to be weeds. There's always going to be ones that it's almost impossible to outcompete. Chickweed for us is probably the biggest issue that, there's certain rotation years where there's just nothing we can do. Those beds just get tons of chickweed in them, and then over the next few rotations that kind of gets squashed out by other crops. So how do you figure out a crop rotation? You need to obviously know what crops you're going to grow and how much of each. You're going to want to know plant families. You're going to want to plant crops together that share similar water and nutrient needs, similar management needs, and that are in similar plant families so that you're able to switch up what's in the beds each year. Then you're going to want to consider things like you're going to want to alternate pest and disease hosts. You're going to want to consider the condition that one crop leaves the field in. Like you need a very fine soil to seed carrots into. So you're not going to want to put carrots in after something that's like corn that's going to leave a lot, like stumpy residue in the soil. You're going to have to consider timing of previous crops, and, fertility, what crop is going to take a lot out of the soil and what's going to follow it that might need that nutrient. Like it might be good to follow corn with beans because beans are going to be corn's going to take a lot of nitrogen out of the soil, but a legume is going to be able to fix its own nitrogen. And so it's just a lot of this stuff that you come up with what would be ideal, and then you look at what you're working with and do the best you can. So this is our crop rotation, and I will, let everybody come back to this if they would like to look at it later. This is a crop rotation on a farm that I used to work on. So that's going to provide you with 2 different crop rotation options. And I did note that in our rotation, and this is true, I think, on many small vegetable farms, that brassicas are one of the largest crop families that we grow. There's just so many vegetable crops that fall into the brassica family. This includes, cabbage, kale, broccoli, arugula, mustard. And so because of that, you'll see that brassicas do rotate more closely than would be ideal. But they are never, rotating less than they always have at least 2 years apart. We're also able to rotate within the section. So if you look back at our rotation, that the scallions are planted 2 years after the garlic. Both of those are in the allium family, but because neither of those take up the entire space of a bed section, we're able to plant them in different sections of that bed so that alliums are not going in that bed, 2 years apart. They're going in separate beds within the same section. So now we are going to dive into more of the specifics of weed, pest, and disease management. And I kind of think about this as the thought process that you would use to determine which foundational or remedial techniques to use. And I'm going to talk some more about what we do on our own farm with some specific examples. So weed management. As in all areas of organic agriculture, you really want to be starting out concentrating on, you need to be starting out concentrating on using foundational or preventative techniques and natural processes to work to your advantage. So you want to start out with all of these weeds, pests, and disease, thinking, what does this thing need? And then you are gonna be basically working against it and figuring out what you can do to deny that thing what it needs while still providing your crops with what they need. So weeds are going to need, they're a plant, right? They're just like your crops. They're going to need sun, water, and nutrients to feed themselves. And so use this knowledge to your advantage. Drip irrigation is going to, decrease the amount of weeds that are able to germinate because it's only watering in specific bands versus everywhere. You can also use techniques like stale seed bedding, which you can prep a bed to plant it, get it fully prepared, then you can water it and let the weeds germinate, and then use some process like cultivating, tarping, flame weeding to kill the weed germination before you put the crop in. You also know that weeds need light because they're a plant. So what can you do to prevent them from getting the light that they need? This is when something like transplanting is going to come in helpful, because putting bigger crops in the ground is going to create shade more quickly. That's going to, even if the weeds do germinate and grow, they're going to have a harder time growing, and they're not going to be able to, get as just grow into as hardy of plants, because they're not going to be getting the amount of sunlight and probably not the amount of nutrients or water that they would like, because they are competing against transplants that are coming into the ground already much bigger. Weeds also need to be, like most seeds, if not all seeds, need to be near the surface of the soil to germinate and reach the light after they do germinate. So you don't want to till so deep that you're bringing up weed seeds that otherwise would just remain in the ground. And I mean, honestly, one of the biggest things, I think I mentioned this in a few slides, which is our biggest thing that we do on the farm to prevent weed issues, is you want to prevent your weeds from going to seed. If nothing else, like that is going to be what saves you, because once a weed goes to seed, the number of seeds that are produced, it's like, one step forward, 8,000 steps backwards to try to catch up from that. So anything you can do to prevent weeds from going to seed, that is what you should do. Weeds, being plants, they're also going to need nutrients. So what can you do to prevent weeds from getting the nutrients? I had already mentioned transplanting. That's going to give the crops, they're going to be pulling more nutrients out, making it harder for the weeds. Cover cropping, which will is also super duper important for weed management. Cover cropping, I think I may have forgotten to mention that in the last section, but cover cropping is a tool that we will talk about, I believe, in a couple. I think we might have talked about it last time. Sorry about that. But cover crops we put in over the winter in beds that are empty, and we also put in any beds that are getting multiple plantings during the year. We'll put a buckwheat cover crop in over the period between the two plantings. And the buckwheat has, I believe I mentioned this last time, has really become my favorite cover crop to use in the summer, because it grows so quickly that it outcompetes weeds for light and water and just general space in very, very effectively. And I found that to be a very crucial tool for weed management on our farm. So here is, I highlighted the things that really are our main weed management techniques on our farm. And our overall goal, as I mentioned, is to prevent the weeds from going to seed, because then you're just having to work so much harder than you need to. I actually do a lot of hand weeding. I prefer this to hoeing because you can remove the weeds more completely. I actually prefer to let the weeds get slightly bigger and go through and hand pull them, because I think that in the long run, I'm able to get the bed clearer and just make it less likely that stuff's going to grow back and that I'm going to have to come through and do it again. My husband, on the other hand, he prefers hoeing. And with that, you're just coming through when the weeds are much smaller. You're hitting them, every week you're coming through the bed, and it's faster. You're doing it every week. We do use black plastic mulching sparingly because I don't want to, I want to minimize the amount of plastic that we're using. But on crops like tomatoes that are in for a long, long time, that can become a very almost unmanageable weed situation otherwise. So we actually on the tomato beds use both black plastic mulch on the actual beds, and then we put straw in between the tomato beds to keep the paths as weed free as possible too. But our primary tool that we use for weed management is tarping. And our tarping technique is that we fully prep beds about 3 weeks before they need to be planted. So that means we mow down any cover crop, we put compost on the bed, and we till in any crop or cover crop residue and the compost, and then we put a tarp down. And the type of tarps we use are called silage tarps. It's become quite a popular technique in small scale organic and just small scale general farming. So you can look it up, silage tarps. They're white on one side, black on the other. Usually we put the white side down, the black side up. That's going to pull heat in, which is going to encourage the weed seeds to germinate. But then when they come up, there's nowhere for them to go. There's no light, no nothing. And so this is a great stale seed bedding technique. So by the time we pull the tarp off 2 or 3 weeks later, suddenly we have, a bed that's completely ready to plant in, and where all the weed seeds that were available, many of them have already germinated and are, anything that comes up later is usually going to be behind the crop that we already put in. I've also included for both pests, diseases, and weeds, I've included the NOP standard, which does mention some techniques that you can use just for, everybody's information. Pest management. So pests are, they're not plants, they are little animals, and their role in the ecosystem is consumers, which means that what they do in life is eat, and either they're going to be eating plants or they're going to be eating each other. And so just like with weeds, you can use your knowledge of their role as consumers to help manage them. So what do pests as consumers need? They're going to need food, they're going to need a habitat, and they're going to need an ecosystem to exist within. So you can use that knowledge against the pests to try to make as inhospitable of an environment as possible for them on your farm. So you know that they want to eat, that they need to eat, and that what they want to eat is your crops. So you want to do things to your crops that are either going to kill the pests, they're going to bother the pests, or they're going to prevent the pests' access to the crops. So examples of these are exclusion, which is our primary technique for pest control. So you can use things like remay, which is also known as row cover. We also use bug netting when it's hot for crops so that they're not getting overheated, because remay will increase the temperature. And then, so obviously exclusion, that's a foundational technique. Pesticides, you can also use pesticides. So these are not conventional pesticides. There's very, very specific pesticides. And I talked previously about how you can look these up on the OMRI website, OMRI. And this is also something where you would talk to your organic certifier to find out what is and isn't allowed. Pesticides, herbicides, fungicides used in organic production need to be naturally occurring, and not even all naturally occurring ones. You can look back from the first webinar for this. Not all of those are allowed. So we use really only two. We use Pyganic and BT, which I will talk about a little more. But the way that this would operate is that, if what you want to do is create conditions on the crop that are going to either kill the pest, bother the pest, or prevent access to the crop, a pesticide like BT, it contains a parasite that does not affect humans. It only affects soft-bodied insects. So that specifically can be sprayed onto crops that are gonna be hosts for things like cabbage loopers, and they will eat the crop, which will have the BT on it, and that will kill them. There's other pesticides that can, you can use insecticidal soap that will do the same thing. You can use things like kale and clay, which I don't use, but have seen other people use, which just creates a kind of an uncomfortable environment for the pest and is going to make them less likely to bother that crop. Okay, pests need a habitat. So what can you control in this department to prevent pest access to your crops? So ask yourself things, look up things like, does this pest overwinter in crop residue or on some other plant? If so, make sure that you're destroying the crop residue, that you're getting rid of the weeds so that you are not creating a habitat for your pests outside of the growing season. You also want to consider things like, can those pests, will they benefit from living in overgrown weeds or grasses around the area? Like, for instance, squash bugs, which are something we have a lot of issues with on our summer squash plants. Those are extremely happy to kind of hang out in grassy border areas. So we've found out if we mow down an entire row of zucchini, the squash bugs will just all move over, hang out in the grass next to there until we plant the next thing of zucchini, and then they'll just move over to that thing of zucchini. So we've had to create techniques to prevent that from happening so that, we're not just creating a habitat for them to live in between when they're eating the zucchini plants. Pests are also part of the overall ecosystem. And so in general, you want to just concentrate on diversity of your crop and non-crop ecosystem in and around your farm. The more diversity you have above and below the soil, the more likely that the pests are going to be outcompeted or, have a predator in the ecosystem, in your farm ecosystem. Whereas, in an unbalanced ecosystem, that's where you get situations where you have pests that are just, out of control, and they're really like the only thing in the ecosystem. If you've got a healthy ecosystem, then like what we've created, like we don't ever need to release natural predators like ladybugs and assassin bugs, because we have enough of an ecosystem on our own farm that we always have plenty of those that help control the pest populations without us doing anything other than, maintaining a diverse ecosystem that attracts beneficials as well as problematic insects. Pest management on our farm. So I just thought I'd just share briefly some of the main pest problems that we have and, kind of how we work through managing them. So cabbage loopers, anybody that's ever grown brassicas is probably going to be familiar with these. They are the moth form of them. You pretty much see everywhere in the summer. They're little white butterflies. And then their larval form, which is what actually eats the plants, is these green caterpillars that start out very, very small and get very, very large and fat. And some of them will have a yellow stripe down their back. So the first thing we do is foundational technique exclusion. We put remay or bug netting on every single planting of brassicas until it gets, either it's done, like stuff that's baby sized, like arugula and our brassica salad mix, that is remade or bug netted from the moment it's planted until it's, mowed down and tilled in. Other things like kale gets too big to be under the net. So eventually we're going to have to remove the netting, and that's when we're going to move on to the next thing, which is monitoring. So it's not like as soon as the netting's off, I'm starting to spray for pests. What I'm doing is going out every single week, several times a week, and checking for the prevalence of pests. Once I start noticing them, then I move on to hand removal. And then if it starts to become a real problem, that's when we would move on to something like spraying BT. And then finally, what we do is once the spring brassicas get to a certain point of pest pressure, we will completely remove them, and we will remove them several weeks before we plant the fall brassicas, the fall kale, so that we aren't, the pests are not able to transfer from the spring to the fall crops. Another issue that we also deal with on brassicas is the harlequin beetle. So again, we start out with everything covered, but by the time the harlequin beetles are around, for the most part, the stuff that they like to be on, which is they really like kale, and they like any brassicas, but the kale is uncovered by the time harlequin beetles show up in the summer. So I start out by monitoring, and then I hand remove the pests 2 days per week and the eggs, and just put them into a container of soapy water. And then we actually have developed this pretty unique technique that we do, where we mow down all of the spring brassicas, all of the kale and cabbage, except one bed. And we use this bed as a trap crop. And then I'll go out in the early morning when the bugs, so this is when it comes in, wanting to know the lifestyle of the bugs, that harlequin beetles are very slow and logy in the early morning. So I'll go out in the early morning and I'll hand cut and bag the tops of each kale plant from the row that we left in. And, I'll put them into like a yard waste bag and fully tape it shut. And this usually successfully removes almost all of the harlequins from the spring plantings. And then we usually don't have to deal with them in the fall plantings because they've been, completely taken off the farm. And that's just something that kind of over the years, dealing with what I consider to be one of the most difficult to deal with pests, that's just a technique that we, kind of stumbled upon by trial and error. Another big one that again affects brassicas, but also eggplant, is flea beetles. And so again, we're going through the process of exclusion first. Then we're letting the plants get big enough that they are able to kind of in the case of eggplant, that they kind of get big enough where they can outgrow the damage. In the case of kale, obviously the damage is to the leaves. And that's the part that we're harvesting. So that becomes a little bit different. We do sometimes have to spray pyganic, which is it's a natural pesticide that's made from the chrysanthemum flower. And it is usually we only have to spray it a couple times on the eggplant, and then they can outgrow it, if at all. On the kale, sometimes we'll have to spray the spring kale a couple times with that, but usually by the point that there's really heavy flea beetle pressure, that's when we decide it's time for those plants to come out, and we will remove the plants at that point. And here is the pest management NOP standards, just for your information. Disease management, same as pest disease, are consumers. They need food, they need a habitat, and they need an ecosystem. So they need food or a host. So how do you interrupt the cycle? You can use crop rotation like we talked about. We on our farm, and I'll talk about this in a moment, we will use biologics that you can I miswrote this. This is supposed to say compost tea, that you can put on the crop's foliage to help outcompete. Drip irrigation, like we talked about, mulching, keeping beds clear of weeds to maximize airflow, using disease-resistant varieties, and again, to maximize airflow, you want to have proper plant spacing. So that's all things that you can do because you know what diseases like. A lot of the diseases we deal with are foliar fungal diseases. They like wet and moist surfaces, which are helped by lack of airflow. So anything that you can do to create an environment that's less hospitable for them, that's what you should do. They need a habitat. So you want to know, like I was just saying, the type of condition that they prefer. Do they like it dry or moist, warm or cool? Do they like living or dead plant matter? You just kind of learn the diseases that you're dealing with, learn what they like, and then do the best you can to create conditions that are going to be non-hospitable to what the disease's needs are. Diseases are also part of the farm ecosystem. And again, having a diversity of organisms above and below the soil is going to make it much more likely that your crops are going to, your diseases are going to have enough pressure against them that they're going to be outcompeted and not become a huge threat within your farm. But crop diversity, just having crop diversity on your farm is so important here, because you will have pest and disease problems and you may even lose a crop. But if you have 30 other crops growing, the loss of one crop in a year is not going to have a huge effect on your overall success the way it would if you were growing, 1 to 3 crops. So we've had years where we've lost the entire basil crop to downy mildew. We lost our entire onion crop one year to root maggots, but we were able to still make money off of these beds because we pulled the onions out, we put another crop in. And so that's like honestly one of the key components to successfully running an organic farm is just the crop diversity. So disease management on our farm, some of the things that we deal with, and probably one of the biggest ones that I know a lot of farmers are dealing with is tomato foliar diseases. So the first thing that I've really, started doing is selecting varieties that are resistant to the diseases. And then you want to make sure that your plant spacing is good. Our tomatoes have gotten farther and farther apart over the years, and that really has helped as we've increased the airflow. Trellising, you can look up the technique called basket weaving. We very heavily trellis the tomatoes so that they are up straight and getting as much airflow as possible. We do prune them for the same reason, to increase airflow. And then we do also start spraying a product called cease weekly, starting from when the plants are quite small. So this is a biologic that performs 2 roles. I misspelled roles there. The bacterial spores that are in the cease. So what I mean when I say it's a biologic means that it actually is, it's got a living bacteria in it, beneficial bacteria. So the bacteria in it will occupy spaces on the plant surface, and it will compete with pathogens and help to limit the amount of space that's available for pathogens. And then it also actually can disrupt the pathogens and actually work against their, them being able to reproduce and live on the surface as well. So that's something we found to be quite helpful with tomato foliar diseases as well. Another big disease we deal with is leaf spot on beets and carrots. Again, variety selection, plant spacing, disposing of the diseased tops. We don't just compost them; those we actually get, take off farm to dispose of. And we also make sure that all the spring crops are out before planting the fall crops so that the diseases don't transfer. And here is the NOP standards for disease management, just for your reference. All right, so just to finish up, I just wanted to talk about a little bit more, go through the foundational and remedial practices that we use on our farm. I would say the biggest one is, what's kind of referred to as the farmer's footprints. I do weekly farm walks to identify pest, disease, and weed issues, and this allows me to catch them early and to deal with them promptly. Tarping, like we talked about, row covers, and bug netting, and I put the brand names that we use for both of those for your reference. Trellising of crops that are going to benefit from, not being on the ground. Pruning the tomatoes. Selecting varieties that are going to be resistant to pests and diseases. So along with disease-resistant varieties, there's also varieties for things like cucumbers that are, have a little bit spinier and therefore are going to be less hospitable to pests as well as diseases. And then we also obviously are using crop rotation. We're using a lot of cover cropping. And I, again, am noting buckwheat for weeds because that's been so successful. We're using cease, and we have also used in the past a few other biologics where we're trying to outcompete diseases. Succession planting, which means that instead of planting 1 crop of cucumber each year or 1 crop of kale each year, we're planting the spring kale. We're removing that, getting rid of the pest issues before we put in the fall kale, so that we are able to, continue growing that all year long. And just generally trying to create a healthy ecosystem to attract beneficials and to allow our plants to be as healthy as possible. In terms of remedial practices, Bacillus thuringiensis, that is the official name for BT that we use on some of the brassicas, and pyganic, those are the main pesticides organically approved that we use, and we use those ones as sparingly as possible. Flame weeding, hoeing or hand weeding, weed whacking, removing and disposing of diseased plant material, and hand removal of bugs are the primary remedial practices that we use on our farm. And how do you know when to step in? So by organic standards, you cannot use remedial practices until you've already used foundational practices. But of course, foundational practices, as you saw in many of my examples, foundational practices do not always work, or at least do not always work permanently. They may put off the issue, but you may get to a point where they're just not doing enough anymore. So how do you know when to step in and start using remedial practices? And this is when you want to know your economic threshold. A certain amount of pest and disease damage is okay and should be expected in organic agriculture. NOP standards require you to aim to minimize this with foundational practices and only intervene with remedial practices when you hit the economic threshold. How do you know when the economic threshold is hit? So you want to consider things like, is the crop sellable? Is the amount of damage going to massively decrease plant productivity? And is the pest disease going to jump to other crops if not controlled? So that's one of the things that I'm considering every week when I go out and do my farm walk, and I'm making decisions. Are we still at a stage where we're working with foundational things, or do we need to move on to stage one of remedial? Am I now hand removing the pest, or is that no longer enough? Am I now needing to spray something? And so those are just, decisions that you're going to be making every single week, every single day almost, as you just analyze, the state of your farm and your economic threshold. So that is all that I have for today.
All right, excellent. One more thing that Denise reminded me that I should let everybody know is that I forgot to mention our April 23rd webinar. It is not on our advertisement that's went out so far, but it is a bonus one. We missed it, and now we missed listing it, which is no big deal because we're still going to have it. You're still going to get a Zoom link, and Katie's still going to be here, and we're going to talk about high tunnel production on April 23rd. So that's not next week, but the week after. High tunnel organic production at 7 p.m. And if you've registered already for this class, you will be registered for the other one as well. And I will go ahead and send out those links so that you will get them on April 23rd. Did anybody have any questions for Katie today? Anybody? Oh, somebody has one in here. Is there a certain time of day that you overhead water to cool plants, and how far above the plants are the overhead sprinklers?
So in terms of time of day, if you're watering, first I'm going to answer not your question, then I'll answer your question. If you're watering for the purpose of watering, of providing just water to the plant, you're going to want to be doing that in the earlier or later in the day, especially when it's hot out, because there's gonna be less evaporation of the water at, when it's cooler and the sun's not as direct. If you're watering to cool the crops down, I usually do that at the hottest time of day, which is usually mid-afternoon. And for the most part, so I am on my farm, I am using either I'm hand watering, so the things as high above as my hand is when I'm watering, or I'm using the type of sprinklers I mostly use are I can't remember what they're called, but they are little heart shape sprinklers that just stick into the soil. I'll have to find what the name is. They've got little green hearts on top, and they're like super low key. They cost like $10. You plug them into the hose. There's no mechanical thing to them. They're just operated by the force of the water, and it, you know, causes them to spin. And so, yeah, those are just sticking straight into the ground. So it's not, you know, like it's probably just like a normal yard sprinkler. It's not, you know, getting super high or super close. It's just providing, you know, the kind of spray that you would see from like an oscillating yard sprinkler.
Okay, great. Anybody else have any questions? Sarah says, thank you, Katie. Great info. And that is absolutely, it's a fact right there. Anybody else have anything? Okay, we look forward to seeing you all on April 23rd. We will be here. You will have Zoom links, and we will do organic high tunnel production on April 23rd. Thanks a lot, Katie. And thank you all for being here tonight.